On the eve of World War II, the British were in a tight spot. On top of the growing tensions in Europe, the fabric of the empire was starting to fray, with independence movements cropping up in every corner, and some with violent agitation. And one of the most controversial was coming from the Mandate for Palestine. Two populations with claims to the land based on history, religion, and political promises from the British government vie for control. One population working within the system, the other seeking to overwhelm it. These tensions and agitations eventually exploded in 1936, when the Arabs across the Mandate took up arms against both the British and the Jews, whose mere presence they despised. The story of the Great Revolt doesn't start in 1936, but when exactly you should start it is kind of difficult to parse, because depending on when exactly you start it, you end up placing more blame on one group or the other. And considering how much of a cesspool the comment sections of my videos about the Israeli, Arab, and Palestinian conflicts are, I am going to start this story in the aftermath of World War I for pure simplicity's sake. But before we get on with the video, I want to tell you about my heritage. In my videos, I typically cover the wider geopolitical facets of modern conflicts, but smaller scale history matters as well, which is why I partnered with MyHeritage. It's a tool that can help you piece together your family's history. Just as national and international history can explain why a country is the way it is, family history can help explain why you are the way you are. And MyHeritage helps you do just that. MyHeritage has this handy tool for helping you build a family tree, allowing for a fractal-like expanse of your family tree as far as you can dive. And it didn't take very long for MyHeritage to discover more family members I hadn't added yet, making the process that much easier. While researching my grandparents, I actually found some photos of my grandmother from her high school yearbook. That I'm sure she'll be surprised to see. And they do this by scouring over 19 billion different documents in their records. You can have photos of your family, which can really bring your family tree to life, and they even have a feature where they can colorize black and white photos as well as animate them. MyHeritage also offers DNA testing, so you can get even more granular with your heritage and find people around the world you had no idea you are related to. If researching and building out your family tree is of interest to you, then I have good news, because MyHeritage has a special offer for viewers of this channel. You can get a 14-day free trial and use all the features of MyHeritage for free and see if you enjoy the experience. And if you decide to continue on with your subscription after the trial, you'll get 50% off. Thanks again to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video, but for now, back to the history. Now for this video, I'm going to be discussing the pre-1919 period as little as needed, but if you want more context on that right now, or preferably after you finish watching this video, then I suggest watching either this video from the Great War channel or checking out Sam Aronoff's channel. You know, it's like, if he hasn't gotten to this stuff already, I know he will eventually. So by 1919, British forces, with substantial help from local Arab populations, had driven the Ottoman Turks out of the Levant. It had been a subdivision of the province of Syria, and very few Arabs would have identified as Palestinian. And even the idea of being Arab wasn't a super strong unifier, certainly weaker than the loyalty to their clans and families. Many histories of the late Ottoman Empire tend to emphasize the second-class stature of Arabs within the Ottoman Empire, but in reality they had been an invaluable asset in governing the southern half of the Caliphate. Southern Syria, in particular, which would go on to encompass the Mandate for Palestine, was dominated by a set of Arab families frequently referred to as the Notables. You had the Khalides, a Jerusalem family that traditionally provided civil servants for the provincial government, as well as judges for the local Sharia courts. You had the Alamis, who also provided civil servants to the Ottomans, as well as frequently occupying the mayorship of Jerusalem. You had the Nusayrbis, whose family had a history of manufacturing weapons for the Sultan's army, as well as holding the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And then you had the Hussainis, who were the most frequent occupiers of the Muftiship of Jerusalem, which controlled the religious sites and institutions of the province and appointed imams for the mosques of Jerusalem. These families all trace their lineage back to descendants of the Prophet, and thus were the first ones alarmed when the Zionists began encroaching upon their privileged status. Again, if you want to know the history of early Zionism, check out Sam Aronoff, The Great War, or even some of the videos from Unpacked. But the extremely short version is that in the latter half of the 19th century, we saw a concerted effort by Jews in Eastern Europe to escape anti-Jewish pogroms by immigrating to Ottoman Palestine. These early settlers faced little opposition from the local populace due to being small in number, as well as their relative poverty. But when Jews in Central Europe, Western Europe, and the United States began taking an interest in Zionism, they began to contribute funds to help buy more land in Palestine and to provide the resources and expertise that allowed Jewish settlers to drain swamps and build thriving farms. This is when you get the notables starting to complain about the presence of the Jews, claiming that they were buying up all the best land, taking their jobs, and trying to replace them. The Ottomans had placed restrictions on Jewish immigration and land purchases in the latter years, but these were all done away with when the British took over. In January 1919, Prince Faisal met with Chaim Weizmann, the president of the Zionist organization. The two would sign an agreement in which Faisal endorsed the Balfour Declaration with the understanding that the Jewish homeland would be separate from his future Arab state. This signed agreement would be brought to the Versailles Conference, and the eventual San Remo Conference would formalize the division of the Levant between the British and French. The British helped the Jews establish their own governing institutions to handle settlement and finance, and they attempted to set up parallel institutions for the Arabs as well. But the Arabs of Palestine were divided along clan and familial lines. But just as important was their opposition to the growing Jewish presence. The Pan-Arabists amongst the notables refused to cooperate with these parallel institutions because they saw it as acquiescing to and legitimizing of the Jewish presence in Palestine. The Jews would create the Palestine Zionist Executive, which was later renamed the Jewish Agency, which became subject to the World Zionist Organization, headed by Chaim Weizmann. The Zionist movement wasn't monolithic, with Weizmann himself being a classical liberal in the Anglo-American sense, while the Labor Zionists, led by David Ben-Gurion, were social democrats and would dominate the Jewish Agency in its early years, prioritizing the immigration of Jews with socialist backgrounds to the mandate over more conservative Jews. The Arabs failed to establish their own secular governing institutions to rival the Jewish Agency. Instead, they founded more locally centric associations consisting of both Muslim and Christian Arabs, with the notables favoring unification with Syria under Prince Faisal, who had recently been proclaimed as King of Greater Syria, and inspired a revolt against the French. The most successful Arab institutions would be religious. During the Great War, the Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin AlHusseini, cooperated with the British occupation, and in return the British elevated his title to Grand Mufti, and placed him in charge of the Supreme Muslim Council, which replaced the older Ottoman institutions that governed Sunni religious affairs in Palestine. The council would not just control the appointment of imams in Jerusalem, but throughout the entire mandate. In April of 1920, the Mufti led the al-Nabi festival procession, which led Muslims on a pilgrimage from Jerusalem to the tomb of Moses located at a mosque outside of Jericho. However, the procession would be incited into a mob by two of its participants, Arif al-Arif, the owner of a local Arab newspaper, and Amin AlHusseini, the younger brother of the Mufti. Arif and Amin were Pan-Arabists and supported King Faisal's revolt in Syria. Arif's newspaper had spread a rumor that the British military supported Palestine being annexed by Faisal's Syria. The riot expanded into the Old City in Jerusalem, which saw Arabs randomly assaulting Jewish pedestrians, robbing Jewish shops, and vandalizing synagogues, not making any distinction between the newly arrived Jews from Europe or the native population of Mizrahi Jews. The Jewish communities responded by setting up their own patrols. The British would declare martial law, taking 3 days to restore order. 5 Jews and 4 Arabs would be killed, with 200 other casualties. Over 200 people would be arrested, and at least a quarter of them were Jewish. One of the arrested Jews was Ze'ev Jabotinsky, a co-founder of the Jewish Legion that fought for the British in the Great War, and the father of revisionist Zionism, a right-leaning variant of Zionism that believed in the establishment of a Jewish state that encompassed territory on both sides of the Jordan River, claiming the maximal extent of the old Jewish and Israelite kingdoms. Additionally, the mayor of Jerusalem, Musa Husseini, the uncle of Kamil and Amin, was removed from office for helping his nephew incite the riots. After the failure of the revolt in Syria, as well as that of the riots in Jerusalem, Musa al-Husseini told other Arabs,
"We must introduce a basic change in our plans here. Palestine as southern Syria no longer exists. We must defend Palestine."
It would take several decades before his conception of Palestine as a separate entity within the wider Arab world would take hold. Arif and Amin would be sentenced to 10 years in prison, but they would escape justice by first fleeing to Jordan and then reaching Damascus, where they sought refuge amongst the Pan-Arabist communities. He would become a popular figure amongst the Arabs of Palestine, being proclaimed a national hero. The British military government would be replaced by a civilian government in July of 1920, which would be headed by the High Commissioner for Palestine and Transjordan, Sir Herbert Samuel, who made a name for himself within British politics by being the first Jew to hold a cabinet position, and he was instrumental in getting much of the leadership of the Conservative Party to support Zionism. Knowing that his Jewishness would make him less trusted amongst the Arabs of Palestine, one of his first actions as High Commissioner would be to declare a general amnesty for the rioters, which would eventually be extended to both Arif and Amin, who would receive a hero's welcome. Some in the British government were hopeful they could appease the Arabs by creating independent Arab monarchies. The colonial secretary, Winston Churchill, hoped that giving the defeated Faisal his own kingdom in Iraq, along with giving his brother Abdullah a kingdom in Transjordan, would be enough to appease the Arab nationalists in Palestine. But it wouldn't, because the Arabs were preoccupied with denying the legitimacy of the Jews, rather than building up Arab power and prestige. A month after the AllNabi riots, Ani Abdelhadi, an associate of King Abdullah, had told a British official,
"We will not rest until Palestine is either placed under a free Arab government or becomes a graveyard for all the Jews in the country. We will finish them off one by one. If not in a month, then in a year. If not in a year, then in 10 years. But our goal will be achieved, and there is nothing that can prevent us from achieving it. Slowly, but surely."
Arab newspapers fed their literate populations a steady diet of propaganda and fear-mongering, which made the process of governing Palestine much more difficult for the British.
In the first place, the people discovered that the disasters which they had been told were about to fall upon them did not in fact occur. The attacks upon their villages by well-armed Jewish colonists, which some of the agitators had announced, did not take place. The day when 100,000 Jews were to disembark in Palestine in order to occupy their lands came and went, and there was no such invasion. Month followed month and year followed year, and no man had his land taken from him. So far from the mosques being closed and turned into synagogues, a new, purely Muslim, elected body was created to which the control of all Muslim religious buildings and of their endowments was transferred. It rebuilt those that were in ruins and began to restore those that needed restoration. It is difficult under such conditions to maintain indefinitely an attitude of alarm. People cannot be induced to remain constantly mobilized against a danger which never eventuates.
The Zionists were not happy with the amnesty granted by the High Commissioner, and since the riots, had already begun to prepare for future attacks by creating their own militia, the Haganah. Under British administration, the Haganah were legally considered terrorists, but British authorities were willing to look the other way due to their inability to protect Jewish communities. Jabotinsky and his revisionists were also upset at the creation of Transjordan, believing the territory was the God-given right of the Jews as part of the Promised Land. One of the most fateful decisions the British made during the Mandate period was in March of 1921, when they supported Amin AlHusseini, the man who instigated the AllNabi riots, to succeed his brother Kamil as Grand Mufti. Kamil AlHusseini died in March, and all the major notables nominated their own candidates, each of which had years of experience studying Islam or serving as judges in Sharia courts. But the Husseinis would nominate Amin, despite him being at most 26 years old with hardly any religious training. But the Husseinis had a few aces up their sleeve. The British were very aware of how controversial it would be for a Christian sovereign to meddle in the religious affairs of non-Christian peoples. They had learned this the hard way in India. The British also had a predisposition to maintain the Ottoman-era order of Palestine as much as possible, and considering the Husseini family were the most frequent holders of the office, and that Amin was the younger brother of the most recent Mufti, they saw this as maintaining continuity. But more important than any of that, the British, like most of Europe, were strapped for cash, and weren't interested in putting down a rebellion, and Amin, with the support of the al-Husseini clan, could easily foster one. So in hopes of avoiding further violence and bloodshed, they would place their support behind Amin, despite him being a virulent anti-Semite. The Husseinis themselves would get the other families to withdraw their candidates through a combination of threats and bribery. Amin al-Husseini would be elected Grand Mufti by an electoral college consisting of imams, Islamic scholars, and local councils. This placed Amin in control of the Supreme Muslim Council, which controlled the appointment of imams to mosques around Palestine, and he would use this power to appoint radical clerics spreading his extremist message. The Mufti reportedly said this to the High Commissioner:
"Just as it is impossible to put two swords into the same sheath, it is impossible to squeeze two people into one small country. There is no place in Palestine for two races. The Jews left Palestine 2,000 years ago. Let them go to other parts of the world where there are wide vacant places."
One of the Mufti's associates, Izzat Darwaza, would say,
Palestine is a purely Arab land, and there is no possibility that another people, with their own language, customs and traditions, and a contradictory political goal, could live with them.
Amin actively sought to foster anti-Semitic attitudes amongst the Arabs of Palestine. He would take a page out of the history of Europe, delving into over a millennium's worth of religious writings within Islam to justify pogroms against the Jews. The Mufti would also become an avid reader of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, quoting them at length in letters, lectures, sermons, and in interviews. He even had the Supreme Muslim Council distribute abridged versions of it in pamphlets. Another riot would break out in Jaffa on May 1st of 1921. Two competing Jewish rallies, one consisting of Labor-Zionists and the other of Marxists, clashed in the streets. Local Arabs would take advantage of the Jewish infighting to assault both groups, along with looting Jewish homes and shops, and they were joined by local Arab policemen. British troops would arrive later that day to restore order. 27 Jews were killed and over 100 were wounded. Members of the Haganah would seek revenge by assaulting Arabs and breaking into their homes. These retaliations escalated into riots as well, resulting in about 50 Arabs and 50 Jews killed. After the AllNabi Riots back in 1920, the British set up a commission to investigate the causes, and concluded that the root were Arab fears that the Jews would demographically, economically, and politically dominate them, and they would blame the Zionist leadership for doing nothing to mitigate these fears. Colonial Secretary Churchill would publish a white paper in response to the Commission's report in 1922, which restated British support for the Balfour Declaration, but rejected the idea of Palestine becoming a wholly Jewish entity. The only restriction on Jewish immigration it proposed was one based on economic capacity. Now, the economic picture of the Mandate period is complex, but if you were to read the Arab narratives of the time, they would imply or just explicitly state that the Arab standard of living either stagnated or got worse, which is just patently false. In this time period, the Arab population grew faster than it did in most other Arab countries, and this was due to improvements made in healthcare infrastructure and financial resources provided in large part by the British colonial administration, as well as the Jewish immigrants bringing money and technical skills. The Arab population grew by over 50% between 1920 and 1936, and it's fairly clear this jump was because of Jewish immigration, because the biggest growth happened in cities with large Jewish immigrant communities. Cities such as Haifa, Jaffa, and Jerusalem saw the Arab populations grow by 86, 62, and 37% respectively, while in purely Arab towns such as Nablus, Hebron, and Gaza, it only grew by 7 and 2%. The standard of living for Palestinians living in cities with large Jewish populations was higher than those of neighboring Arab states. Arab farmers benefited as well, with more technology and capital available. Life expectancy grew from 37 in 1926 to 50 by 1944. And child mortality shrank by 34% in the first year, 31% in the second, 57% in the third, 64% in the fourth, and 67% in the fifth year. There's also the issue of land sales, and again, if you read the Arab accounts of this, they would basically make it look like that it was just Jews would show up to a random Arab farm with a bunch of British soldiers and just outright steal the land, but that was not the case. The Jews and Zionist institutions bought every square inch of land they owned. And again, Arab newspapers were responsible for spreading misinformation about this. By 1935, a year before the revolt, individual Jews and Zionist institutions collectively owned a total of 7% of the land in Palestine, despite encompassing nearly 30% of the population. The reports of the Jews buying up all the land and all the best land is a distortion by the very self-evident jealousy of the Arab journalists. In the early years of the Mandate, it was the large landowners that sold most of the land to the Zionists. Amin himself did not sell land to the Jews, but he acted very angry at those who did, calling it a crime against God. But punishment and intimidation for doing so were mostly reserved for smaller landowners. Despite his public pronouncements against the Jews, in private, Amin frequently sought their services to enrich himself or his clan. A Jewish lawyer he hired, Bernard Joseph, would say,
Arab nationalists were never allowed to harm the interests of the Husseini family.
The Mufti's cousin, al-Husseini, would use a Jewish lawyer in a litigation battle over a land dispute with a rival Arab family, and then proceeded to sell that land to Jews. Now, although the lives of Arabs did materially improve, that improvement wasn't evenly distributed. Obviously, the Arabs that lived near large Jewish communities benefited more than those living further away, but the Zionist institutions tried to economically isolate themselves from the rest of Palestine. The Jewish Agency and the National Fund constructed settlements for Jewish immigrants to live and work in. This resulted in the Jewish community building up their own infrastructure and farms, and they hired almost exclusively Jewish workers. This was done for a few reasons. Firstly, the Zionists were fighting against age-old anti-Semitic stereotypes. Throughout the history of Christian Europe, the Jews were frequently referred to as landless people who were living off the labor of Gentiles, while never producing any material wealth on their own. By the 19th century, the Jews of Europe had taken up careers that required a lot of education and had become a sizable presence within finance. But this was because the various rulers of Europe for over a millennium had forced them to. In most of Europe for the last 1,000 years, Jews weren't allowed to own land, which meant they couldn't be farmers. They were also kept out of most specialized trades due to medieval guilds frequently requiring its members to be baptized, which keeps practicing Jews out of those professions. Additionally, the Christian Bible prohibited Christians from usury, which is the charging of interest on financial loans. However, Jewish scripture was typically interpreted as only forbidding usury against co-religionists, meaning they could charge interest on loans to non-Jews, but not fellow Jews. Charging interest on loans is the easiest way to make a profit in finance, which resulted in far fewer Christians being involved. Christian rulers in Europe would thus use their local Jewish communities to fund their war efforts, borrowing money, often with implied or explicit threats that if they didn't lend them the money, they would be punished. The Christian rulers would continue to borrow money until they couldn't afford to repay their lenders anymore, at which point they would expel the Jews from their territory and confiscate their property. This happened repeatedly throughout European history. Force the Jews into a position where finance and usury was their only means of earning a living, and then condemn and punish them for doing it. Another reason for Zionist institutions only hiring Jewish workers was political ideology. At this time, and basically until the 1970s, Labor-Zionists had a monopoly on most Zionist political institutions, and they envisioned a future socialist homeland for the Jews where everyone worked on collective farms. It would be a classless society where nobody earned a profit off the labor of someone else. Since about 3/4 of all Jewish workers were members of the Histadrut, a labor union, it was easier to guarantee good worker relations with Jewish workers than Arab ones who did not have an organized union. The third reason for only hiring Jewish workers was simple practicality. Most of the Jews didn't speak Arabic, and most of the Arabs didn't speak Hebrew or whatever European language they were communicating in. It was also done in order to make the Jews of Palestine economically self-sufficient. They didn't want to become dependent on the Gentiles for food, labor, or protection. This policy made the Jews a more sticky presence in Palestine, possessing the ability to support and defend themselves, but for decades their retort to Arab critics was that everybody would be better off. But by excluding Arab workers from the upper echelons of the Jewish economy, the Zionists failed to get any Arab stakeholders into the Zionist project. The Arab notables tolerated the Jewish presence so long as they could earn a profit from land sales. Throughout the Mandate period, all of the anti-Zionist factions continued to protest the British government against the Jews being permitted to buy land. If nobody had been willing to sell, the Jews obviously could not have bought. But Arab owners eagerly took advantage of a booming market, even acquiring new properties in order to sell them. And a bunch of them did so believing that that land would eventually just make it back into their hands because they assumed the Jews would either eventually be expelled or exterminated. And this belief was perpetuated and exacerbated by the Grand Mufti.
How can the Jews be respected for their wealth at a time when they spread wickedness and misery throughout the world? They tortured their innocent prophets, killed John the Baptist, rejected Jesus. They corrupt morality in every single country, destroy all religions, and sympathize with communist Russia. They rob people's property, steal money by usury, and distort the prophets' preaching.
Of course, the Arabs weren't alone in believing that there was little hope of coexistence between them and the Jews. In his 1923 article, The Iron Wall, Ze'ev Jabotinsky predicted that the Arabs would not ignore the growing Jewish presence in Palestine indefinitely, and that they would actively fight against the establishment of a Jewish state.
As long as the Arabs feel that there is at least hope of getting rid of us, they'll refuse to give up this hope in return for either kind words or for bread and butter. Because they are not a rabble, but a living people. And when a living people yields in matters of such a vital character, it is only when there is no longer any hope of getting rid of us, because they can make no breach in the iron wall. Not till then will they drop their extremist leaders.
But unlike most Arab writers, Jabotinsky did see a path forward.
Then we may expect them to discuss honestly practical questions, such as a guarantee against Arab displacement, or equal rights for Arab citizens, or Arab national integrity. And when that happens, I am convinced that we Jews will be found ready to give them satisfactory guarantees, so that both peoples can live together in peace, like good neighbors.
By the late 20s, the Arab leaders realized they did not possess the means to defeat the Zionists on their own, and so they worked on internationalizing the conflict, making anti-Zionism the unifying force of pan-Arabism and Islam. The Grand Mufti did this by trying to increase the perceived importance of Islamic holy sites in Palestine, with a particular emphasis on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Now, there are numerous holy sites within Islam, but which ones are important was largely regional. The cities of Mecca and Medina were deemed important by all Muslims, but Jerusalem was, at best, a distant third in importance, and for the most part it was only really important to Muslims in the Levant. Otherwise, most Muslim communities had their own local holy sites occupy that third spot. Amin AlHusseini waged a propaganda war to boost the Al-Aqsa Mosque's status as being on par with Mecca and Medina. And he did this by fostering and exploiting fears that Jews were planning on destroying the mosque and rebuilding the temple in its place. In pursuit of this, he also claimed that the Western Wall was an integral part of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, tying it to the Islamic tradition that said the wall was where Muhammad tied his winged steed before he ascended to heaven. On November 1st, 1927, Amin hosted the Islamic Congress, with 700 representatives from across Palestine, along with foreign observers. They sent a delegation to the mandatory government and demanded that there be no change in the status of the Western Wall. The Islamic Congress would also establish branch organizations around the world, and called for collective action by Muslims to keep the Western Wall Islamic. The Congress also declared a prohibition on land sales to Jews, and that the Mandate government remove Jews from high positions. Traditionally, the Jews had limited rights to pray at the Western Wall, as it, along with the Temple Mount, was owned by the Islamic Waqf. The Jews had been allowed to worship at the Western Wall since Ottoman times. However, there were numerous restrictions, but more often than not, the Islamic authorities were willing to look the other way, especially when they were bribed. But since the election of Amin as Grand Mufti, the restrictions were more stringently enforced. Any physical alteration to the site, even temporary addition of furniture, prompted the Muslims' suspicion that the Jews were trying to find a way to give the wall the status of a synagogue, as a first step in taking it over. The British wanted to maintain the Ottoman-era status quo for the religious sites in Palestine, and for them this meant enforcing the laws as written rather than as traditionally enforced. To reiterate this point, the British issued a white paper in February 1928 supporting the Grand Mufti's position that the Jews were only allowed to pray silently at the Western Wall and were not allowed to bring benches, screens, or any religious artifacts with them. On September 23, 1928, the day before Yom Kippur, a Beetle from a local Ashkenazi synagogue brought a large Torah ark, lamps, and a screen to the Western Wall. A local sheikh saw the setup and told the British authorities that there would be violence if the Beetle and everything he brought with him wasn't removed. Police told the Beetle to take everything down and leave, but he refused. In a scuffle with the police, the Beetle, holding the Torah ark, was thrown down an alley filled with cacti, which angered Jewish newspapers and sparked protests in Jewish communities. The Grand Mufti began a media blitz to propagandize Islamic ownership of the site. The Grand Mufti wrote to the government,
"Having realized the bitter experiences, the unlimited greedy aspirations of the Jews, Muslims believe that the Jews' aim is to take possession of the Mosque of Al-Aqsa, gradually on the pretense that it is the temple, by starting with the western wall of this place, which is an inseparable part of the mosque."
Amin and the Supreme Muslim Council intentionally increased tensions at the wall. They orchestrated counter-protests at government offices to pressure the British into enforcing its decision, along with demonstrations at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. He also ordered the muezzin at the Dome of the Rock to revive the Zikr ceremony, which consisted of a loud chant and a drum. They also built a new office for the Sharia court overlooking the wall, but the British had not given support to Amin's claim that the Western Wall was an exclusively Muslim site, and tensions continued to escalate into the summer of 1929. In June 1929, Arab youths beat up an old Beetle praying at the wall. A month later, Muslims began banging drums, gongs, and cymbals near the wall, which was part of a recently revived Sufi chant. The district commissioner demanded they stop, but the Mufti would double down, and built a small mosque on top of a nearby house and installed a muezzin to lead the 5 daily prayers, with an apparent order to grow louder every week. On August 15, 1929, the day before the anniversary of the destruction of the First Temple, the British reaffirmed the wall was Islamic property and banned the prayer screens and the blowing of the shofar. 6,000 Jews in Tel Aviv and 3,000 at the wall would gather in protest. On August 16th, 300 Jewish youth, mostly followers of Jabotinsky, marched to the wall. After 2 minutes of silence, they waved the Zionist flag and sang the Hatikvah and chanted, "The wall is ours." That same day was also the Prophet's birthday, which the Supreme Muslim Council commemorated by leading a procession of 2,000 people to the wall, where they beat up Jewish worshippers, burned Jewish holy books, and desecrated the scraps of paper with prayers written on them that were inserted into the cracks of the wall. On August 17th, a Jewish teenager was killed by Arabs after his soccer ball rolled into an Arab tomato patch in a village on the outskirts of Jerusalem. In retaliation, a Jewish mob then stabbed an Arab teenager who managed to survive the attack. August 21st, the funeral of the Jewish teenager saw cries of vengeance, which led Jewish mobs to attack Arabs at least 12 times, with Arab gangs retaliating at least 7 times. On August 24th, 1929, after Friday prayers, the Imam at the Al-Aqsa Mosque told the thousands of worshippers to defend their holy sites to the death.
Go pounce on your enemies and kill, that you in doing so may obtain paradise.
Large portions of the crowd rushed away, some pulling out knives, swords, and pistols. The crowd killed 2 Jews near the Jaffa Gate and ran up Jaffa Road, attacking pedestrians and setting stores on fire. In Hebron, a man arrived by motorcycle and claimed that the Jews had killed hundreds of Arabs and encouraged them to kill the Jews living in Hebron. A student at the yeshiva was lynched, while another managed to evade the mob by hiding in a well. An Arab British official, Superintendent Kafarata, told Jewish leaders to concentrate their community into a small number of homes, saying it would be easier to defend them. Representatives of the Mufti met with Kafarata, ordering him to join the fight against the Jews, but Kafarata refused. The next morning, more atrocities were committed. Arab mobs murdered, raped, and dismembered defenseless Jews. 67 were killed and over 50 wounded in one day. There were Arabs, however, who protected their Jewish neighbors, letting them hide in their homes, saving at least 250 of them. Were it not for them, Kafarata believed not a single Jew would have survived. But the assaults spread to 24 locations where Jews had settled. After 6 days, 133 Jews were killed, and nearly as many Arabs would be killed by the British trying to restore order. The riots became an international news story. President Hoover expressed sympathy for the Zionists. A Cairo newspaper, Al-Haram, said,
"The Arabs will fight in defense of their interests. If the government practices the policy of silence, it will be the silence of the flame, which will suddenly burst forth."
Newspapers in Britain debated whether it was worth it for the British to remain in Palestine. The British government responded by calling a commission of inquiry headed by Sir Walter Shaw. When interviewed by the commission, the Grand Mufti started quoting a copy of the protocols he had brought with him. Jabotinsky was also interviewed due to many of the other witnesses referencing him. He told the commission that Europe was incurably anti-Semitic, and thanks to the US restricting immigration from Eastern Europe, the Jews had nowhere else to go but Palestine. He wanted at least 30,000 Jews a year to come to Palestine so they could create a Jewish state with a Jewish majority population, and desired eventual sovereignty. After his testimony, Jabotinsky was banned from re-entering Palestine. The final report condemned the Mufti's campaign around the Western Wall as incendiary, but acquitted him of culpability. The commission would claim that the revisionists' march to the wall on August 16, 1929 was the true cause of the riots. Arab testimonies had claimed that the Jews had drawn first blood, but the final report rejected this.
The outbreak in Jerusalem on the 23rd of August was from the beginning of an attack by Arabs on Jews.
It also stated that Jewish violence,
though inexcusable, were in most cases in retaliation for wrongs already committed.
In 1930, another commission was set up in order to discuss the future status of the Western Wall, but the Grand Mufti denied all rights for Jews in Palestine, not just at the Western Wall. Jewish immigration to Palestine escalated in the early 1930s, with the Jewish population growing from about 17% in 1931 to about 30% in 1930. But Arab newspapers radically inflated those figures, along with those of land sales, further radicalizing the Arabs. It was the uncertain figures around illegal immigration that the Arab authorities exploited to create fear. One paper wrote,
"The day is not far off when the Zionists will succeed in wiping out any trace of the Arabs from this country. Will the establishment of the Jewish national home end when the number of Jews in Palestine reaches 500, a million, 10 million? after the Jews have purchased every piece of land in Palestine, Transjordan, and afterwards Syria and Iraq?
To stop illegal Jewish immigration, the Youth Congress sent one of its militias to patrol the Netanya coast, but it would spend most of its time getting into fights with local Jewish youths. These militias were organized in the countryside, with the Safed Band, known as the Green Hand, led by Ahmad Tafish, and the Black Hand, led by Sheikh Iz al-Adin al-Qassam. Another commission was sent to determine what should be done about the violence. The Hope Simpson report was released in October 1930 and condemned the Jewish Agency and Histadrut, claiming the Arabs were in no way benefiting from the Jewish economic activity. It said there wasn't much land left for Jews to buy, and unless the Arabs seriously modernized their agriculture, further Jewish purchases would lead to a landlessness crisis. What should be remembered, however, is that at this time, Jews and Zionist institutions owned less than 7% of the land in Palestine, and most of it was not farmland at the time they bought it. A white paper would be issued the same day the report was published, in which quotas on Jewish immigration would be implemented, and that these quotas would be contingent on Arab employment levels rather than the capacity of the Jewish economy. It also restricted land sales. Chaim Weizmann resigned as president of the World Zionist Organization in response, and a Jewish protest in Warsaw grew to around 50,000 people. An international media campaign by Zionist activists with endorsements from influential figures like Winston Churchill, Herbert Samuel, and Lloyd George pressured the government of Ramsay MacDonald to walk back the white paper, which succeeded. In Parliament, MacDonald would say that Jewish settlement was the mandate's primary purpose in February 1931. That same year, Sir Arthur Grenfell Walkup was named High Commissioner for Palestine. Unlike most officials of his time, Walkup actually liked Jews and supported the Balfour Declaration. Despite this, Walkup also genuinely cared about the welfare of the Arabs, frequently meeting with random Arab farmers and asking them their opinions on issues and what they needed. This led him to hire Musa Alami as an advisor, who would be named his personal secretary for Arab affairs in 1933. Musa Alami was a member of one of the Arab notable families in Jerusalem that had provided civil servants to the Ottomans, as well as occupying the Muftiship when the Hussainis were out of favor. Musa was educated in Britain, which meant he was popular amongst British colonial officials, seeing him as a window into popular Arab opinion, and a moderate with whom the Zionists might negotiate with. He graduated from Cambridge in 1924 and returned to Palestine, marrying into a Pan-Arabist family from Damascus, and would be hired by the Mandate's Attorney General's office. He was annoyed at the British's seeming lack of interest in the affairs of the Arabs, while also being uninspired by Arab society, who refused to organize themselves in any meaningful way against the Zionists. The failure of the traditional leadership of the Arab Palestinians to change British policy led to popular support shifting to more extremist figures, as well as looking to the Arab states for aid. And as the frequency of assaults on Jews increased, the Yishuv began organizing its own militias to protect Jewish settlements. A conference was held in Nablus by the National Arab Society, led by Izzat Darwaza, which called for setting up Arab militias and acquiring weapons, as well as criticizing the Arab executive, the Arab parallel to the Jewish Agency. The credibility of the old notables was further degraded when a report was published exposing the lackadaisical attitude many of them had toward land sales. The other Arab notables would follow the popular trend toward extremism. The failure of the old institutions led to new, typically more radical groups being formed. In 1932, Abdel Hadi, the close associate of King Abdullah of Transjordan, founded the Independence Party as a Palestinian branch of a greater Pan-Arabist movement. The party consisted of activists and academics from outside Jerusalem, who opposed the self-defeating rivalries of the notables. They still saw Palestine as southern Syria and supported annexation into Transjordan, and they typically refused to cooperate with parties that were front groups for the notables. The Independence Party would also establish the Youth Congress, who predominantly focused on setting up militias and attacking Jewish settlements. All this while storm clouds were growing dark over Europe. The Nazis came to power in January 1933, which sent the Zionists into a panic. The German consulate in Jerusalem raised the swastika banner above it, leading to many instances of Jewish youth sneaking onto the consulate grounds to take the flag down or deface it. On March 31, 1933, the Grand Mufti met with the Consul General, who communicated to Berlin.
The Mufti told me that Muslims inside and outside of Palestine greet the new regime in Germany and hope for the spread of fascist and anti-democratic state authority to other lands.
On April 1, 1933, the German government held its first boycott of Jewish stores. A week later, the Jews were banned from government jobs and later as lawyers, doctors, accountants, and musicians. A month later, they began burning all books by Jewish authors. The Mufti and other Palestinian notables met with the Consul General at the Nabi Musa shrine, where they asked Germany to do all it could to keep Jews from coming to Palestine. Zionist officials secretly went to Berlin to negotiate an agreement with Hitler to allow Jews in Germany to go to Palestine. In exchange, all of these Jews would deposit their money into a Zionist-run bank that would use the money to buy German-manufactured goods that would be imported into Palestine. This became known as the Havara Agreement. The Yeshiv was split over the deal. The Labor Zionists supported it as a pragmatic solution to solve the plight of Jews in Germany. Jabotinsky and the revisionists, however, would decry the deal as disgraceful. The agreement's creator, Haim Arloslarov, would be assassinated in Tel Aviv in June of 1933. The plan would bring tens of thousands of Jews to Palestine, along with $35 million in capital. Despite Hitler approving the exiling of Jews from Germany, he didn't want an independent Jewish state.
They have no thought of building up a Jewish state in Palestine so that they might perhaps inhabit it, but they only want a central organization of their international world cheating.
Fearing that it was losing what little sway or legitimacy it had with the Arabs of Palestine, the Arab executive, headed by Musa al-Husseini, called for a strike and demonstrations against the Mandate government in October of 1933. The strike lasted a week, but rather than target Jews, they targeted the British. Protesters attacked British officials with stones and clubs, and when they charged the government headquarters, the police opened fire, killing 26. The Zionists believed that Amin was behind the riots. Musa Alami told the government that the Arabs were beginning to think they shouldn't work with the British at all.
If all that can be expected from this present policy is a slow death, it is better to be killed in an attempt to free ourselves of our enemies than to suffer a long and protracted demise.
Zionists in London lobbied the government to have Alami removed from his post, believing that he had undue influence in the Mandate government. He would be reappointed as a government advocate in the Palestine justice system, and at that point, he was the highest-ranking Arab to hold a position in the justice system, and despite being moved, he still had influence amongst the Mandate's executives. The strikes would be Musa Kazim's last major act, dying in March of 1934. After his death, the Arab executive ceased to be a functional institution. Amin and the Husseinis would try to depose the sitting mayor of Jerusalem, Rajib al-Nashibi. Since the Husseinis didn't have quite enough power in Jerusalem for one of their own to win the election, they would back the Khalidi's candidate, Dr. Hussein al-Khalidi. The Husseinis also won the mayorships of Lydda, Jericho, Majdal, Talcam, Beatshin, and Beersheba. Dr. Khalidi's administration would focus its attention on local affairs, thus reducing the importance of the mayorship of Jerusalem in national affairs. With the Nashibi clan no longer holding the mayorship of Jerusalem, they no longer controlled any significant public office, resulting in the rise of more political parties. The Nashibis founded the National Defense Party, which was opposed to the Husseinis and the Grand Mufti. They advocated independence for Palestine, but were not pan-Arabists, and sought cooperation with the British. They had close ties with King Abdullah of Jordan, and like all of the Arab parties, they were anti-Zionist, but they did have a cordial relation with the Jewish Agency and sought some kind of arrangement with the Jews already in Palestine. The Husseinis would create the Palestinian Arab Party, which was led by the Grand Mufti's cousin, Jalal Husseini, and was directly inspired by the Nazi Party. They were pan-Arabist and demanded full and immediate independence and rejected all rights for Jews in Palestine. As tensions were rising, the heads of the Jewish Agency, David Ben-Gurion and Moshe Sharet, met with Musa Alami to see if they could come to an arrangement between the Arabs and Jews. Ben-Gurion tried to convince Alami that allowing more Jews into Palestine would be beneficial to the Arabs, but Alami was not open to this if it allowed the Jews to become a majority of the population. Ben-Gurion then proposed the creation of a pan-Arab federation with an autonomous Jewish province.
The Palestinian Arabs will not be sacrificed so that Zionism might be realized. According to our conception of Zionism, we are neither desirous nor capable of building a future in Palestine at the expense of the Arabs. The Palestinian Arabs will remain where they are. Their lot will improve, and even politically, they will not be dependent on us, even after we come to constitute the vast majority of the population.
Alami was more open to the idea of a pan-Arab federation, but was apprehensive about the economic disparity between the Jews and Arabs, saying that he would rather the country remain poor than rely on Jewish immigration to enrich them. Ben-Gurion and Alami met in September of 1934. Alami wanted to talk economics and asked Ben-Gurion why the Labor-Zionists only employed Jews. which David explained was because Jews in Europe were always accused of living off the labors of others while never working the land themselves. Alami suggested that a Jewish autonomous state could be built around Tel Aviv as part of an Arab federation with British protection. He was also open to allowing unlimited Jewish immigration to Palestine, but only after the formation of an Arab federation. In another talk that month in Jerusalem, Alami told Ben-Gurion that the Mufti knew about their talks and that the Mufti gave his okay to continue so long as Ben-Gurion could issue a public declaration to mollify Arab fears. Alami later suggested that the Mufti and Ben-Gurion meet in person. Ben-Gurion would then meet with Alami's father-in-law in Geneva, Ihsan Jabri, the editor of the Arab nationalist paper. David told him that they hoped to bring 8 million Jewish immigrants into their state and make Palestine a Jewish majority state. Jabri balked at the suggestion and said that the Arabs would never recognize such a state. After Ben-Gurion left Geneva, the content of their meeting was published in La Nation Arabe, despite being told the meeting was secret. Ben-Gurion and the Mufti would never meet, and it would be another decade before he and Alami would meet again. Tensions continued to rise in Europe. Hitler attained absolute power in 1934 upon the death of President Ludendorff and proclaimed himself Führer. He began to rebuild the German Air Force in violation of the Versailles Treaty, and in 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, which led Arabs in Palestine to believe that the Western democracies were in decline.
The Middle East in its entirety is awaiting this opportunity and is doing what it can to hasten its arrival in the belief that war is the only means whereby the Arabs could achieve their national aspirations and put an end to the Zionist threat.
Another Arab paper called for an Arab Hitler to rally the Arab peoples to kill the Jews once and for all. al-Husseini frequently quoted Hitler in his writings and speeches, and the Husseinis founded numerous organizations modeled on the Hitler Youth. The Mufti would regularly meet with the German consul in Jerusalem, asking for Germany to speak out against the Jewish presence in Palestine, and telling him,
The Muslims in Palestine and elsewhere were enthusiastic about the new regime in Germany and looked forward to the spread of fascism throughout the region.
In 1935, Jerusalem Mayor Hussein Khalidi was planning to found a moderate Arab party that would emphasize the need for a negotiated settlement.
The Jews have come to the country, have taken its citizenship, and have become Palestinians, and it is impossible to throw them into the sea. They have also bought lands and obtained lawful title deeds, and these must be respected. There is no point in ignoring these clear matters.
He backtracked these statements after receiving death threats from the Husseinis and called for a ban on land sales and immigration of Jews to Palestine. This immigration had led to the growth of Haifa, with the first modern port in all of Palestine being built there, along with its first international airport and a pipeline bringing oil from Iraq to the Mediterranean. The Jewish-owned Palestine Railways was headquartered there, as well as the Nesher Cement Works. Most of the building boom in Haifa was fueled by Jewish immigration, and by 1935, Haifa was majority Jewish. 42,000 Jews were allowed into Palestine in 1934, and 62,000 in 1935, making Jews about 30% of the population. In October of 1935, Arab workers at Jaffa port found a cache of weapons from Europe disguised as barrels of cement. The paperwork said the delivery was for a Jewish merchant in Tel Aviv. The news stirred anger amongst the Palestinian Arabs, which was additionally fueled by reports of anti-British and anti-French strikes in Egypt and Syria. Later that month, all of the parties, except for the Independence Party, met in Jerusalem to decide on joint action. On November 6th, Qassam, the head of the Black Hand militia, and his companions sold their belongings to buy weapons and hide them in a cave near the Gilboa Hills. 3 policemen, a Jewish sergeant and 2 Arab constables, came across the cave, and Qassam's men killed the sergeant, but let the Arabs go. After that, Qassam and his followers were on the run. They were found in a forest near Jenin, where they had a 4-hour standoff with the police, where Qassam and his 3 men were killed and turned into martyrs by Arab newspapers. After Qassam's funeral, the Arab parties issued a joint declaration, calling for a general strike, and issued a set of demands: a halt to all Jewish immigration, a halt to all land sales to Jews, and the creation of a legislature for Palestine that excluded Jewish representation. Their list of demands came with a threat, saying that if they were not met, they could not restrain their people from violence. Now, the British had actually been trying to set up a legislature for the Mandate Palestine since 1922, but they couldn't get the Jews and the Arabs to agree on an apportionment for it. The Jews demanded equal representation between the Jews and Arabs despite still being a minority of the population, while the Arabs rejected any plan that gave Jews representation at all. In March of 1936, the House of Commons was debating a proposal from High Commissioner Walkup that would create a legislative council for Palestine that granted the Arabs a majority voice, but the proposal was rejected by most of the Conservative Party. Winston Churchill, who by this point was adamantly anti-Hitler, decried the proposal as a death sentence for Germany's Jews.
Their blood and race declared defiling and accursed, every form of concentrated human wickedness cast upon these people by overwhelming power, by vile tyranny, when that is the case, surely the House of Commons will not allow the one door which is open, the one door which allows some relief, some escape from these conditions, to be summarily closed.
On April 15th, a band of Arabs on the road between Nablus and Tulkarem set up a roadblock and extorted passing cars for money, but they were explicitly raising funds to procure arms. A pair of Jews in a truck were stopped, told to hand over their money and park their car on the side of the road. As more cars drove by, another Jew was stopped and told to hand over their money and then told to sit in the first Jew's truck. The Arabs later came back to the Jewish men in the truck and demanded more money, and when they told them they had none, they were all shot. And one of them, Israel Hazan, died. He would be the first victim of the Great Arab Revolt. Thanks again to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video. In order to get a 14-day free trial, click my link down in the description. I'd also like to thank my patrons for supporting this channel. Their support allows me to spend more time working on bigger videos like this. Patrons get access to a special patrons-only Discord server, as well as getting early access to ad-free versions of the videos, as well as access to my notes and scripts. If any of that interests you, then check out patreon.com/casualhistorian to learn more. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.